Picture this. The year is 1537, and in the shadowed corridors of the Medici Palace in Florence, a small child's laughter echoes through marble halls that will soon fall silent forever. 4-year-old Giulia doesn't know that her father, the Duke of Florence, lies dead in a pool of blood just rooms away. She doesn't know that her world is about to shatter like Venice glass on cold stone, and she certainly doesn't know that centuries later, her very existence would be painted over, erased from history as if she never existed at all. But she did exist, and her story will break your heart. Now, let me take you back to Renaissance Florence, where our story begins not with Giulia, but with her father, a man whose very existence challenged everything Europe thought it knew about power, blood, and belonging. The winter of 1510 was harsh when Alessandro de Medici drew his first breath in Florence. Even from birth, whispers followed him like shadows. Official documents would later claim Lorenzo di Piero de Medici as his father, but in the servant quarters, in the market squares, in the hushed conversations behind silk fans, people spoke a different truth. They whispered that his real father was Giulio de Medici, destined to become Pope Clement VII. And his mother? Simonetta da Collevecchio, a woman whose dark beauty had caught a powerful man's eye. But it was Alessandro's appearance that made tongues wag most of all. His skin was darker than the pale marble statues that adorned Medici gardens. His hair curled tight against his head. His features spoke of lands beyond the Mediterranean, of ancestors who had walked under African skies. They called him Il Moro, the Moor, and in those two words lay both insult and intrigue. Some claimed his mother had been a Moorish slave. Others suggested she was from North Africa, her bloodline carrying the memory of ancient queens. The truth dissolved like morning mist in the Arno River, but one thing remained crystal clear. Alessandro de Medici protected Alessandro with the fierce devotion of a father. The boy received the finest education, learned diplomacy and warfare, lived among princes. Despite whispers about his birth, despite sneers about his heritage, Alessandro rose. Then came 1527, and with it war. The Medici were swept from Florence like leaves in an autumn storm. Alessandro fled into exile, his world reduced to uncertainty and longing for home. But blood will tell, and money speaks all languages. By 1531, the Medici had returned, not as mere citizens, but as rulers. Alessandro became Florence's first hereditary duke, the Republic's funeral bells ringing as dynasty's cradle songs began. Now, imagine Alessandro in his prime, 25 years old, absolute power coursing through his veins like wine. He was controversial, this dark-skinned duke who held one of Europe's greatest cities in his palm. His enemies called him tyrannical, debauched, a man who took mistresses like other men took meals. His supporters saw a protector of the poor, a ruler guided by justice and common sense. Truth, as always, lay somewhere between love and hatred. Among his mistresses was Taddea Malaspina, a noblewoman whose bloodline stretched back through centuries of Italian nobility. She was beautiful, they say, with the kind of ethereal grace that made poets weep and painters despair of capturing her essence. From their passionate union came 2 children. First, Giulio in 1532, then our Giulia in 1535. Close your eyes and picture baby Giulia in those early days, sleeping in silk-lined cradles, attended by nurses who moved like ghosts through perfumed chambers. She had her father's strong features, his dark curls, his intense gaze that seemed to see straight through to one's soul. Though illegitimate, she was Medici, and that name alone was worth more than most kingdoms. Alessandro acknowledged his children openly, showering them with affection despite having no wife to legitimize them. Perhaps he remembered his own bastard birth, his own climb to power despite society's whispers. Perhaps he saw in little Giulia's eyes the same determination that had carried him from rumored slave son to Duke of Florence. But fate, that cruel mistress, was already sharpening her blade. In 1536, Political necessity wrapped itself in white satin and orange blossoms when Alessandro married Margaret of Austria, daughter of Emperor Charles V. She was just a child, 14 years old, while he was a man of 26 who had already lived several lifetimes. The marriage was meant to secure alliances, produce heirs, cement Alessandro's grip on power. Instead, it became a beautiful cage for both bride and groom. Alessandro continued visiting Tadea, continued lavishing attention to his beloved illegitimate children. Love, it seemed, could not be commanded by imperial decree. But, in the shadows, his cousin Lorenzo de Medici watched and waited, plotting betrayal with the patience of a spider. January 6th, Epiphany Night. While Christians celebrated the arrival of wise men following a star, Alessandro followed his cousin into a trap that would end everything. The meeting was supposed to be private, secret, perhaps romantic. Lorenzo had promised to arrange an encounter with a beautiful woman. Instead, he delivered death. Cold steel found its mark, and Alessandro de Medici, the first Black Duke of Florence, breathed his last at just 26 years old. Picture little Giulia waking the next morning, 4 years old and still innocent of tragedy. Perhaps she asked her nurses why everyone moved so quietly, why a grown-up's faces looked like storm clouds, why her papa hadn't come to play with her. Children sense sorrow, even when they cannot name it, and Giulia would have felt the palace's grief settle over her like a winter cloak. With Alessandro dead and no legitimate heirs, power shifted to Cosimo I, a teenager from the Medici's junior branch who suddenly found himself Duke of Florence. Imagine his dilemma: what to do with his predecessor's children. They were living reminders of the man he'd replaced, potential rallying points for discontent, but they were also family. More importantly, they were innocents.
Cosimo made a choice that would shape Giulia's entire life. He sent her to Villa di Castello, a peaceful estate nestled in the hills outside Florence where his own mother, Maria Salviati, could watch over her. But Giulia wouldn't be alone in exile. Waiting for her was Giulia de Medici, Cosimo's own illegitimate daughter, just 2 years younger and hungry for companionship. Imagine these two little girls meeting for the first time. Giulia with her father's dark features and watchful eyes, Giulia fair as morning light with her father's determined chin. They became more than cousins, they became sisters of the heart, filling the villa's chambers with laughter, sharing secrets whispered under moonlight, creating their own small world away from court intrigue. Maria Salviati governed them with love tempered by discipline. She was a woman who understood power's burdens, having navigated Medici politics for decades. Under her care, both girls received educations fit for princesses. Languages, music, art, deportment, all the skills needed to move gracefully through aristocratic society. But paradise, even childhood paradise, cannot last forever. February 1542 brought fever to the villa, one of those swift illnesses that stalked Renaissance children like wolves hunting lambs. Both girls fell sick, their small bodies burning with heat that no amount of cold cloths could ease. Giulia, now 7 years old, fought the fever and won. Little Giulia, barely 6, was not so fortunate. Death claimed her with the casual cruelty that marked those times, leaving Giulia alone with her grief and a bedroom that suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too empty. Picture Giulia in the days that followed, a child trying to understand why her dearest friend and sister would never laugh with her again, never share whispered stories in the dark, never chase butterflies through the villa's gardens. Grief changes us all, but it shapes children in particular ways, teaching them early that love and loss walk hand in hand. Yet Giulia was resilient, as children often are. She threw herself into her studies, into the careful choreography of court life. As she grew older, observers noted how she carried herself with unmistakable pride in her heritage. Yes, she was illegitimate. Yes, her skin was darker than most court ladies. Yes, whispers followed her about African blood and slave ancestry. But she was Medici. descended from the main line, daughter of a duke who had been compared to Julius Caesar himself. She would not bow her head in shame for anyone. By her early teens, Giulia had blossomed into a young woman of striking beauty. She had her father's strong features softened by feminine grace, her curly hair tamed into fashionable styles, and his intense gaze that could make grown men uncomfortable. Court observers noted her resemblance to Alessandro, and in an age where bloodline meant everything, that resemblance was both blessing and burden. Cosimo's wife, Eleonora de Toledo, took particular interest in Giulia's appearance and status. Once, when Giulia was 12 or 13, Eleonora flew into a magnificent rage because Giulia's riding cloak was improperly made, the wrong length, insufficient ornamentation, not worthy of a Medici connection. Such attention to detail revealed how seriously the family took Giulia's position, illegitimate or not. As 1550 approached, Giulia stood on the threshold of womanhood at 15, and Cosimo began the delicate negotiations that would determine her future. Marriage, in those days, was diplomacy dressed in silk and sealed with dowries. For a young woman of Giulia's birth and beauty, suitors lined up like players auditioning for roles in a grand drama. The winner was Francesco Cantelmo, Duke of Popoli, a nobleman whose bloodline satisfied even Medici standards. Giulia's dowry was magnificent, worth tens of millions in today's currency, a clear signal that despite her illegitimate birth, she was valued as highly as any legitimate princess. The wedding must have been spectacular, though history has swallowed the details like a greedy mouth consuming delicacies. Picture the young Duchess of Popoli in those early married years. Finally legitimate, finally recognized, finally able to take her place among Europe's nobility without whispers following her. For 5 years, she lived the life she had been prepared for since childhood, managing households, hosting gatherings, navigating the complex social webs that defined aristocratic existence. But happiness, like morning dew, can vanish without warning. In 1555, death knocked at Giulia's door again. Francesco Cantelmo breathed his last, leaving his young wife a widow at barely 20 years old. Imagine her grief, not just personal loss, but the terrible uncertainty that faced women in those times, when widowhood could mean social death as well as emotional devastation. Yet Giulia chose to face her sorrow with dignity that would have made her father proud. She commissioned Alessandro Allori, one of Florence's master painters, to create her portrait. In it, she appears magnificent in her grief, dressed in widow's weeds, but radiating strength. Her dark eyes hold depths that speak of loss transformed into wisdom. Beside her sits an elaborately carved chair, the meaning debated by art historians for centuries. Some see Hercules climbing steep terrain, others glimpse Laverna Mountain, where St. Francis received his stigmata. Perhaps the symbolism matters less than the message. Giulia de Medici would not be diminished by tragedy. During her widowhood, she found solace in faith and family. Her half-sister Porzia had become abbess of the Augustinian convent of San Clemente, and Giulia spent considerable time there, finding peace in prayer and supporting the convent financially. She became patron to other Augustinian institutions as well, channeling her wealth toward acts of devotion and charity that helped her wounded heart. But God, it seemed, was not finished writing Giulia's story. In 1559, love found her again in the person of Bernardetto de Medici, one of Cosimo's cousins. Their marriage brought her back into the family fold completely, and in 1560 she gave birth to a son whom she named Alexander in honor of her beloved father's memory. Imagine her joy, finally holding her own child, seeing in his tiny features perhaps an echo of the father she had lost so young.
Giulia and Bernardetto lived well in those early years, entertaining lavishly and engaging in diplomatic affairs that reminded everyone of their importance. But even happiness carried complications in Medici territory. 3 years after his wife, Eleonora di Toledo's death, the aging Grand Duke Cosimo took a young mistress named Eleonora degli Albizzi, a woman barely half his age. Their relationship produced children and considerable scandal, particularly when court gossip suggested that Giulia demanded to be treated as the young woman's equal. Such audacity strained her relationship with Cosimo, though they later reconciled. By 1567, Giulia and Bernardetto had decided their future lay beyond Florence. They relocated to Naples, where they fought for and won the title and lands of the Principality of Ottaviano. Picture them in their southern kingdom, Giulia finally able to rule in her own right, managing estates, patronizing religious institutions, securing her family's future with the same political acumen that had carried the Medici name to greatness. Her descendants, through son Alessandro, would hold the title of Princes of Ottaviano for generations, a noble line that persists even today. Yet even as she built this legacy, Giulia was being slowly erased from history itself. For centuries, one of the most poignant examples of this erasure hung in plain sight. Pontormo's painting of Maria Salviati appeared to show the formidable woman alone, stern and dignified in her widow's weeds. But in 1937, restoration revealed a shocking truth. A child had been painted over, deliberately hidden from view. When the layers of later paint were carefully removed, there she was, a young girl with distinctive features and an anxious expression, pressed close to Maria's protective side. Most experts now believe that child is Giulia de Medici, making this one of the first European portraits of a girl of mixed African and European ancestry. To see her face emerge from centuries of concealment is to witness history's attempt to silence her finally fail. Her dark eyes seem to look directly at us across the centuries, as if asking why she was hidden, why she was forgotten, why her story was deemed too dangerous to remember. Picture Giulia in her final years, a woman who had survived assassination's aftermath, exile's loneliness, widowhood's grief, and history's amnesia. She had loved and lost and loved again. She had borne children and built legacies. She had navigated Renaissance politics with skill that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Her husband Bernardetto died before her, sometime after 1576, leaving her to face her final act alone. When death came for Giulia de Medici in 1588, she was 53 years old, which was considered a good age in those times, when life expectancy barely reached 40. She had outlived her father by 35 years, had seen Florence transform from republic to duchy to grand duchy, had watched her own children grow and thrive. But perhaps her greatest victory was simply this: she survived. Despite every attempt to erase her, despite centuries of historical amnesia, despite being painted over and written out, she survived. Her story endures because stories like hers demand to be told. They remind us that history is not just the province of kings and popes and famous men, but belongs equally to the daughters and wives and mothers whose lives intersected with greatness, who shaped events through quiet strength and fierce determination. Giulia's son Alessandro became Lord of Ottaviano and General of the Papal States. Her descendants later attempted to claim the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany when the main Medici line died out in 1737, though they were ultimately unsuccessful. But success and failure are temporary things. What lasts is the courage to live fully, to love deeply, to face whatever storms arise with dignity intact. As we close this chapter of Giulia's story, imagine her one final time, not as the anxious child in Pontormo's painting, not as the grieving widow in Allori's portrait, but as she might have appeared in her final years. Picture a woman of substance and grace, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, watching sunset paint the Neapolitan sky and shades of gold and crimson. She has known love and loss, power and exile, joy and sorrow. She has been daughter, sister, wife, mother, patron, ruler. She has lived. And in living fully, in refusing to be diminished by circumstance or silenced by history, she achieved something more precious than any title. She claimed her place in the great human story, the one that connects us all across centuries and continents, the one that reminds us that every life matters, every story deserves to be told, every voice deserves to be heard. Giulia de Medici may have been illegitimate, may have been mixed race in an age that valued neither illegitimacy nor diversity, may have been painted over and forgotten by official history. But she was also resilient, brilliant, determined, and ultimately unforgettable. Her story survives because it must survive. Because in remembering her, we remember something essential about human dignity, about the power of women to shape their own destinies, about the way love transcends every boundary that society tries to build. The little girl who woke up orphaned in a Medici palace became a woman who ruled her own principality. The child who was exiled became the adult who chose her own exile. The daughter who inherited nothing but whispers and scandal became the mother who founded a dynasty. That transformation, from powerless to powerful, from forgotten to remembered, from hidden to revealed, is perhaps the most beautiful story Renaissance Italy ever produced. And now you know it too, dear friend. You have heard Giulia's voice across the centuries, seen her face emerge from history's shadows, understood that she was never really lost, only waiting for someone to look closely enough, care deeply enough, love strongly enough to bring her back to light.